Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a time when the world outside your front door is nothing but the damp smell of thatch and the slow drift of wood smoke curling through gray morning mist. When the creak of a wooden cart axle is the loudest thing you'll hear for hours. And the only alarm clock you own is the chill wind sneaking in under your blanket of coarse wool. Your bed is a pile of straw with a sack of flattened chaff for a pillow, and as you open your eyes, you already know your day will be hard enough to make a modern gym session look like a nap. You probably won't survive this. No, seriously. Statistically speaking, medieval peasant life is a series of small negotiations with hunger, sickness, and your lord's demands. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you dropped your location and local time in the comments. Makes it more fun knowing where in the world you re-listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before the sun because the sun is a lazy thing compared to you. You've been up and moving since the rooster first decided to announce itself to the village, and the air bites at your skin as you pull on the same tunic you've worn for the last 3 days, maybe longer, but you've lost track. Outside, the village is a patchwork of low huts huddled together. Walls of wattle and daub, roofs of straw that leak when the rains come, and narrow paths of mud that cling to your shoes, so you carry half the road with you wherever you go. There's the smell, always the smell, a mix of animals, smoke, and the sweet rot of compost that tells you exactly where you live in the social order. Far from the perfumed halls of the nobility, and deep in the earthy reality of working the land, you trudge toward the small plot you tend, a strip of soil that is both your lifeline and your daily burden. And as you pass other early risers, you nod, exchange quick murmurs about the weather, the quality of the grain, the rumors that someone in the next village over has been taken ill with something that makes the skin blackened. You store that thought away like a dark seed because right now you have a list of tasks that will not wait. The soil is hard from the frost and you break it with a wooden-handled hoe. Your hands already calloused enough that you don't need gloves. It's not glamorous, this life, but you know every inch of it. Where the earth floods in spring, where it dries too quickly in summer, where the best weeds grow, if you need something vaguely green to add to the pot. Somewhere in the background, a bell from the manor calls the workers. Its clang heavy with the knowledge that time isn't yours. Not really. You are a serf, and that means the land you work belongs to the Lord, and so does a portion of everything you pull from it. Historians still argue whether serfdom was closer to slavery or just an extremely unfair rental agreement. But you, Don Tiki, have time to ponder the finer points of feudal economics. When the sheep have wandered too close to the unfenced garden, you shoo them away, muttering under your breath, and make a mental note to repair the crude hurdle later. You can't afford to lose anything. Not a single onion. Not one egg, because last winter was lean, and you remember the way your stomach ached, the hollow feeling in your chest, and how you chewed slowly, just to trick yourself into thinking the food might last longer. The quirky thing is even in this grinding routine, there are moments of odd beauty, the way frost feathers the edges of a cabbage leaf, the sudden appearance of a wren hopping between the furrows, the smell of fresh bread, when someone in the village manages to bake. You pass by a neighbor who is already repairing the roof of his hut, tying bundles of straw with careful hands, and he tells you the traveling peddler is back in the area. The one with tin spoons and bright ribbons, though you know you can afford neither. Still, you picture the ribbon in your mind. That tiny splash of color in a life painted mostly in browns and grays. By mid-morning, your muscles ache from bending and lifting, but the work doesn't pause for rest. Not really. You grab a piece of coarse bread from your satchel, perhaps with a sliver of hard cheese, if you were lucky enough to save it from yesterday's meal, and you eat while you walk the fields checking for signs of pests or blight. You remember a year when ergot fungus ruined half the rye crop, sending strange visions through the village. Some swore it was witchcraft, others said it was the devil, but the truth was in the grain itself, laced with a poison you couldn't see. Your breath fogs in the cold as you glance toward the manor house, a silhouette against the pale sky. Its stone walls, a reminder of who holds power here. You've been called up before to help repair those walls, to haul timber, to clear ditches, all without pay, because your labor is part of the rent you owe. Sometimes you wonder if the Lord ever notices the faces of those who keep his world running, or if you're just another moving shape in his fields. The truth is, your life is defined as much by what you endure as by what you do. The endless repetition, the grinding uncertainty, the quiet understanding that survival isn't guaranteed. You take comfort in the small rituals. The way you always stop by the well to draw water on your way back from the fields, the way you feed the chickens before anything else when you get home, the way you and your family gather round a single fire in the evening, sharing stories and warmth. Tonight, maybe someone will bring news from the next parish. Maybe there will be a song, or maybe you'll just listen to the wind pressing against the walls and imagine you somewhere else. But for now, as the sun finally rises and spills light over the village, you keep working, because in this life, the day belongs to those who refuse to let it crush them. You know the road ahead is long, and each day is a new bargain with the land, the weather, and the Lord, who owns it all. But you also know that as long as you can stand up and face the morning, you are still here. And for now, that's enough. You move from the morning's first chores into the deeper work of the day. Because farming in this age is never just a matter of planting a seed and waiting politely for it to grow. It's a dance between you and the weather, between the soil and the countless hazards that stalk the crops. A daily negotiation with nature that will not hesitate to punish any lapse in attention. And so you find yourself bent over the furrows, pushing the heavy wooden plow your oxen pull, feeling the uneven drag as it bites into the damp earth. The smell of fresh-turned soil thick in the air, and the cold seeping up through your boots, reminding you that even though it's spring, warmth is still a visitor, not yet willing to stay. Your hands grip the handles tightly, your shoulders ache, but this work must be done now, or there will be nothing to harvest when the year turns. And you think about how every single grain that will keep you alive in the dark months ahead depends on what you do in these weeks. There's no safety net, no storehouse of plenty waiting somewhere, not for you. And though historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly lived on the edge of starvation, or whether the image has been exaggerated by later storytellers, you know from your own memories of thin winters that hunger is always close, closer than the Lord's manor, closer than the church, closer even than the nearest neighbor. And as you guide the plow, you glance toward the sky for signs of change. Reading the clouds as if they were an old text you've studied your entire life, hoping for the right mix of sun and rain, for too much of one or the other can ruin everything. In the distance you hear the rhythmic thud of a flail as someone else threshes grain left over from last season. A sound that to you is both comforting and ominous. Comforting because it means someone still has food. Ominous because the pounding reminds you how finite it all is. Every pile of grain shrinking with each passing day. And in your own hut, the sacks are already lighter than you'd like. You think about the strange barley the peddler once sold here, a variety with kernels darker than usual, said to come from across the sea, and some swore it was cursed, because the bread it made was dense and heavy. But others claimed it kept longer, without going moldy, and you'd try anything if it meant one more week of eating in February. But for now, you're stuck with what the land will give you. By midday, the sun is higher, and you pause only long enough to drink from the leather flask at your side. Water drawn from the well before dawn, cool, but carrying that faint mineral taste you've known since childhood, the kind of taste you never question because it's the only water you've ever had. Your oxen snort and shift impatiently, and you pat their flanks, murmuring to them as if they were people, because in a way they are part of your family's survival, as essential as your own hands. The quirky truth is that these animals often have names more formal than some of the children in the village. And you remember a neighbor who once named his pigs after the saints in hopes it would keep thieves away, though it didn't because hungry. Men do not respect saints' names when their bellies are empty. The ground here has been turned before, many times, the same small plots worked by the same families for generations, and sometimes you find strange things in the soil. A fragment of pottery with a design you've never seen. A piece of iron bent into a shape you can't identify. And once even a small silver coin with a face so worn you couldn't tell which king it once belonged to. Each of these things a reminder that the land holds more than grain. It holds the history of everyone who's lived and died here. As the afternoon wears on, you shift to mending the hedges that mark the boundary between your strip and the one next to it, weaving branches together so they'll grow thick and keep the animals out. Because one stray goat can undo weeks of work in a single night, and you learn to spot the signs that something has been nibbling where it shouldn't. A fresh set of tracks in the mud, a tuft of wool caught on a low branch. You trade a quick word with the neighbor on the other side, agreeing to watch each other's fields. And you both laugh about the time a herd of geese got loose and terrorized the entire village, chasing children and even a priest who was carrying a basket of apples. Still beneath the laughter is the understanding that every mouthful of food counts, and losing any of it to animals, whether or theft, could tip the balance in the wrong direction. Toward evening, you gather the day's small harvest. Perhaps a few handfuls of early greens, some eggs, if the hens were generous, and you load what you can into a basket to carry back, your body tired in that deep, bone-heavy way that makes sleep come easy but never lasts long enough. Because the moment the rooster starts again, tomorrow, you'll rise and do it all over, adjusting for whatever new challenge the day brings. And as you walk back along the muddy path, you can't help but glance toward the manor again, its stone walls catching the last light. And you wonder if the Lord has ever truly known what it's like to stand in a field and watch your entire livelihood grow inch by inch, entirely at the mercy of forces you can't control. And whether he understands that while he may own the land on paper, it's your sweat that keeps it alive. Back at your hut, you set down the basket, wipe your hands on your tunic, and begin the evening tasks. Because there's always more. Feeding the animals, checking the thatch for leaks, bringing in enough wood for the fire to last a night. And you do it all without thinking. Muscle memory carrying you through. The rhythm of a life where every motion is tied to survival. And though no one will ever write your name in a book or carve it in stone, each furrow you've turned, each seed you've planted is a mark you've left on the world, one that will feed someone tomorrow. And that, you think as the sky turns dark and the first stars appear, is worth something. The change from working a field that gives enough to one that gives nothing is as sudden and brutal as a door slamming in your face. And you feel it not in the moment the last green turns brown, but in the weeks afterward, when the baskets you carry home seem lighter and the small store of grain you keep in the corner of the hut begins to look alarmingly shallow, because famine doesn't arrive with a fanfare. It seeps in quietly, like a draft through the cracks, taking root in the pit of your stomach before you've even admitted it's here. And you find yourself looking at the hedgerows differently, scanning them for nettles and dandelion greens, remembering which trees produce the bitterest but still edible nuts, and asking around to see if anyone's caught fish in the stream lately. Though the truth is, the stream has been stingy this year. Its water low and sluggish, a perfect breeding ground for sickness. But you drink from it anyway when the well seems too far to walk. You begin to hear more stories from the neighboring villages, tales of fields so dry, the earth cracked open like old pottery, of hailstorms that flattened barley just days before harvest, of children sent to beg at the gates of the manor only to be turned away because the stores inside are reserved for the Lord. Estable and historians still argue whether medieval lords were always so ruthless or whether scarcity simply forced everyone into cruelty. But from where you stand, leaning on your hoe and staring at a row of withered cabbages, the distinction doesn't matter, because no one is handing you bread. You've started to stretch your meals, thinning the pottage with more water, slicing bread so thin it tears in your fingers, saving scraps in a small cloth bundle for the next day's labor. And when hunger grumbles in your belly at night, you press your hands to it and try to imagine the warmth is fullness. There's a strange, almost comical moment when you find yourself gnawing on the rind of a cheese, so old it smells like the inside of a wet boot, but the salt and fat are a comfort. And you remind yourself that you've eaten worse, like the year your family boiled leather straps to soften them enough to chew the taste, lingering like a bad dream. In the woods, you find mushrooms, and you wish you knew more about which ones won't kill you, because old Marta swears the red-spotted ones are safe if you boil them 3 times. And old Marta is still alive, so maybe she's right. But you've also seen a neighbor's lips turn blue after a foraging gamble gone wrong, so you stick to the pale caps you recognize, cooking them down until they shrink to almost nothing. Once, you even tried grinding acorns into a coarse flour, soaking them to leach out the bitterness. And while the bread it made was heavy and strange, it filled you for a few hours, which is more than you can say for the handful of rose hips you chewed last week. In these times, you start thinking of barter differently, eyeing the small wooden spoon you carved last winter or the extra pair of woolen socks your wife spun, wondering if someone might trade food for them. Though the truth is, no one trades fairly when they're starving, and a spoon might get you half an onion if you're lucky. The quirky thing about famine is that it makes unlikely things valuable. A pot of honey becomes worth a week's work. A small cask of ale could buy you a hen. even though in better days no one would dream of parting with a hen for something they can drink in an afternoon. Some in the village have taken to poaching in the Lord's forest, setting snares for rabbits or even risking a deer if they're bold. But the penalty for being caught is steep. Sometimes a hand, sometimes your life. And you weigh the gamble each time you walk past a tree line, listening for the distant baying of the Lord's hounds. The children's faces grow thinner, their eyes bigger, and you feel a stab of guilt each time you eat something they don't. But you also know that if you collapse from hunger in the fields, no one will feed them at all, so you ration your strength along with the food. At night, you hear whispers about villages farther off where people have left their homes entirely, setting off to seek better land, though most never return. And you wonder if they found something better or simply disappeared into the endless roads. Once, you catch sight of a beggar at the crossroads, his clothes little more than rags, holding out a wooden bowl. And you almost laugh at the idea that you have anything to spare. But you give him a heel of bread anyway, because part of you hopes that mercy, like hunger, might be contagious. Hunger makes people irritable. Quarrels break out over things so small you barely remember them afterward. And old rivalries that were once just grumbles turn sharp. Yet it also knits strange alliances, like the time you and the neighbor UVA argued with for years worked together to lift a fallen tree so you could reach the bee nest inside, sharing the honey like it was gold. As the weeks pass, your body adapts in cruel ways, the hollow in your cheeks deepening, your belt tightening to its last notch, your steps slower but more deliberate, and you find yourself dreaming of food more often than you dream of anything else, waking with the taste of roast meat or fresh bread still vivid on your tongue, before it fades into the gray light of morning. And when the rains finally come, late but heavy, you stand in the doorway of your hut and watch them soak the earth, feeling both relief and dread, because they've come too late to save this season's harvest. But they might make the next one possible, and in that thin hope, you find enough reason to go out the next day and start again, pulling weeds from the few surviving plants, checking the traps you set by the hedges, and telling yourself that survival isn't about winning against famine. It's about holding on long enough for famine to lose interest in you. It starts as whispers carried along the muddy track from the next village, scraps of overheard talk while you're mending a fence or drawing water from the well-muttered accounts of sudden illness that blackens the skin and takes a man from standing to buried in less than a week. And you try to treat it like any other grim rumor, because there are always stories of sickness. But these rumors cling like burrs, and soon they rejoined by the sight of a cart rumbling into the village with more stillness than weight in its load, the limp arm of someone's cousin hanging over the side, and suddenly the air feels thicker, harder to breathe, as if the plague itself has crept ahead of its victims. You notice the way people pull their cloaks tighter and keep their distance, the way even friendly voices seem to speak through a veil of caution. And although historians still argue whether the Black Death arrived in every corner of Europe with equal ferocity, or whether some pockets were spared through isolation, from your point of view, the question is academic at best, because isolation is not something you can buy. You live where you live, and the trade roads that bring the occasional luxury also bring what rides on the rats and fleas. You begin to see signs without even looking for them. The strange swellings in the neck or groin, the fevered eyes that roll beneath half-closed lids, the rattle in the breath of the man who was helping you split what only last week, And now there is a strange ritual of absence in the village. A house that was noisy yesterday is silent today. A familiar face at the well has vanished, and no one wants to ask where they've gone. The quirky detail you can't shake is that some swear the cats are to blame, killing them out of fear, which only makes the rats bolder. And you think of the irony that the one creature who might have kept the fleas at bay is now being chased from every doorway. You start hearing the bell from the church tolling more often, sometimes twice before midday, and the graveyard fills in a way that makes the land itself look startled. Fresh mounds rising beside the old stones, and digging those graves becomes its own grim duty. The gravedigger working with a scarf over his face, though it's unclear whether that's to keep the smell out or the sickness in. You can stop your mind from running through a mental map of who has fallen ill and who is still moving about, calculating the invisible distance between you and danger, wondering if it's carried on the breath, the touch, the very air. Some in the village have taken to carrying posies of herbs at their belt or under their nose, convinced the sweet smell will ward off the corruption. And though you don't quite believe it, you find yourself doing the same, plucking rosemary and sage from the patch behind your hut and tucking it into your tunic, breathing through it when you pass the houses where the shutters are closed, even in daylight. The market in the next town has thinned to a shadow of itself stalls. Empty traders absent, and those who still come keep their goods and hands close, voices low, as if speaking too loudly might call the plague's attention. You notice the change in how people greet each other. No more clasping of hands or clapping of shoulders, just a nod from a few steps away, eyes darting to check for any sign of illness. You try to keep your head down, working your strip of land as if the rhythm of sowing and weeding could build a wall between you and what's coming. But then you hear that the priest has taken sick, and there's a sharp chill in your stomach, because if a man of God is not spared, what hope is there for the rest of you? Some families begin to board themselves inside, leaving food out for the chickens in haste before retreating indoors. Smoke from their hearth, the only sign they're still there, and you wonder whether they'll emerge to sunlight or not at all. One afternoon, you see a man walking the lane alone, muttering to himself and swinging a whip of knotted cord against his back, the red stripes bright against his shirt, and someone explains, he's a flagellant traveling from place to place to atone for the sins that have supposedly brought the plague upon the world. And you watch him pass with a mix of pity and unease. There's talk of whole streets being abandoned, in towns doors barred, windows shuttered, and of pits being dug to hold more than one body at a time. A thought you try to push from your mind when you close your eyes at night. You think about what might happen if the fields go untended, if the hands that usually sow and reap are too sick or too gone to work them, and you feel that double weight of fear, one for the sickness and one for the hunger that will surely follow. You've heard some say that the best defense is to keep moving, to flee to the countryside. But you are already in the countryside and the sickness is here too, so instead you move differently, keeping to yourself. Speaking less, watching more, and the silence that grows in the village is the loudest thing you've ever heard. You wonder if there's some sign you might see before it strikes, some warning that would let you hide. But all you know is that it comes without regard for age or strength, taking the young with the old, the healthy with the frail. And so you carry on, feeding the animals, tending what's left of the garden. And each time you cough, you pause, just for a heartbeat, to listen to your own body, measuring the sound for anything new. Because in times like this, survival feels less like living and more like waiting to see if you've been chosen. When the plague moves close enough that you can see its marks on your neighbor's skin, the scramble for remedies begins, and suddenly every old tale, half-remembered recipe, and whispered superstition becomes a lifeline you cling to no matter how absurd it might sound on a calm day. So you find yourself visiting the village's so-called wise woman, her hut thick with the smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, bundles of lavender, rosemary, and something acrid you can't name, rustling gently when the door opens and she looks you over the way a shepherd inspects a sheep, muttering about humors and bad air before pressing a small pouch into your hand, telling you to hang it near your bed so the scent will drive off illness. And though you know deep down that a bit of mint and sage isn't going to wrestle the plague into retreat, you thank her anyway, because sometimes the comfort of doing something is as important as the cure itself. You hear of monks at the monastery mixing vinegars infused with garlic and rue, claiming the sharpness cleanses the air. And a few bottles find their way into the village. The liquid so sour, it makes your eyes water when you drink it. But you drink it anyway, telling yourself that maybe if it dosed in tea, keep the sickness away, it will at least keep you too busy gagging to notice you re-sick. Then there are the traveling quacks rolling in with carts covered in gaudy painted signs of miraculous recoveries, wearing strange beaked masks stuffed with spices to protect themselves from the miasma, selling powders, tonics, and amulets at prices that make you want to laugh until you remember that if one of them actually works it, would be worth every coin you'll never have again. And historians still argue whether such figures were true predators on the desperate, or simply the only doctors some villages ever saw. But you can bring yourself to decide when the choice is between your dwindling coins and doing nothing. A neighbor swears by burning certain woods in the hearth to cleanse the air, so you watch smoke from oak, juniper, and applewood drift lazily through the dim rafters, wondering if it's really protecting you or just giving you something pleasant to smell in a season otherwise thick with rot. Another says that wearing a red ribbon around your neck will keep the sickness from entering your body. And you think it's nonsense until you notice half the children running about with frayed scraps of crimson cloth flapping against their chests, because fear has a way of making the improbable seem like common sense. The quirky thing is how some cures feel more like punishments, like the poultice a man from the next parish swears by, made from ground-up toads mixed with vinegar, which he applies to his armpits while claiming it draws the plague out through the skin. And you wonder if the plague might just leave out of pity for what he's put himself through. Others turn inward to prayer, lighting candles before saints' images until the church smells of melting wax and hope. And even those who grumble about the priest's taxes can be seen kneeling in the pews at dawn, their whispers filling the cold stone air. And you do it too, because if there is even a chance that divine mercy is a cure, it's foolish not to ask for it. Then there are the bleeding men, convinced that the sickness comes from an imbalance of blood and other humors. So they cut their skin to let the bad blood out, standing pale and weak, but certain they've bought themselves more time. And you shake your head, but also can't deny that the healthy and the desperate are hard to tell apart these days. You find yourself making small bargains in your own head. One less bite of food for you in exchange for a better chance for your children. A day's work left undone to avoid standing too close to others. A charm of rowan berries worn beneath your shirt, because it costs you nothing and might cost you everything not to wear it. You hear of villages upstream where they VA started hanging pots of boiling vinegar over doorways so the fumes bathe anyone who enters, and of families who keep fires burning in every room to drive out the damp, their walls sweating with heat. And though it seems impossible that these things could truly matter against an invisible death, you also know that the invisible makes its own rules. Some cures are almost comically small, like chewing cloves of garlic until your breath could flatten a horse, or drinking beer brewed with sage and nettle, which tastes like bitterness itself but at least fills your stomach for a moment. You notice how people become collectors of remedies, trading them like seeds. One woman giving you a sachet of chamomile for the vinegar you've steeped with thyme, as though swapping might double the strength of both. Yet behind every charm, potion, and ritual, there is the knowledge that they are only nets thrown into a storm. And still you keep throwing them, because doing nothing feels like lying down and inviting the plague in for supper. Sometimes you wonder whether the remedies themselves aren't part of the sickness, not in the sense of causing it, but in the way they seem to feed on fear, growing wilder and more elaborate the more people fall, until you hear of a man in a far-off town who wore a necklace of crushed emeralds mixed with honey, convinced the gems would draw out the poison, and you imagine him sticky, green, and very probably dead. And so you walk the fine line between skepticism and survival, knowing that the only true medicine might be luck, but also knowing that luck favors the ones who at least try. And as you hang the herb pouch by your bed that night, breathing in its sharp, grassy scent, you tell yourself that even if it does nothing for your body, it might be enough to quiet your mind until morning. Life under the Lord's thumb is something you feel in your back as much as in your bones, because the ache from bending over in the fields all day is nothing compared to the weight of knowing that no matter how hard you work, a portion of it will be taken, counted, and carried up to the manor. And it begins early in the season when the steward comes down the path with his small entourage, taking notes on a wax tablet as he inspects your strip of land, asking how many oxen you have, how much seed you've sown, and whether you've repaired the ditches as you were told. And you answer politely, knowing that any hesitation might invite suspicion, because suspicion means fines, and fines mean you will pay twice over. Once in a grain. You give up, and again in the hunger you feel when there is less left for you. He reminds you of your labor obligations, the days you owe on the Lord's domain fields, and you nod because there's no choice. And when those days come, you leave your own plot untended while you and the others trudge to the wide, flat land near the manor where the soil is richer and the plows are heavier, and you work under the eyes of the bailiff, whose job is to make sure you're reworking hard enough to earn the right to go back to your own land. Historians still argue whether the feudal bargain was fairer in some places than others, whether certain lords offered protection and stability worth the cost. But standing knee-deep in mud that belongs to someone else, swinging a scythe for someone else's harvest, it's hard to imagine fairness has much to do with it. You hear of men in distant shires who rose against their lords, burning records and refusing dues, and while part of you thrills at the idea, another part knows that rebellion often ends in ropes and heads on spikes, and that the manor has more men-at-arms than your village has pitchforks. Still, the small rebellions happen in whispers and sidelong glances, in the way you slip a little extra from the manna as harvest into your own sack when no one is looking, or the way the miller grinds a bit more flour than the official measure and sends it home with you under a cloth. The quirky thing about the Manor's demands is how detailed they can be. Not just grain and labor, but hens, eggs, firewood, and even a portion of the honey if you keep bees. And if you don't have these things, you're expected to find them or pay in coin, which is a joke since coin barely circulates here, and the only people with silver pennies in their purses are the Lord's own men. Once a year, sometimes twice, there's a muster, when every able-bodied man is called to bring whatever weapon he has. Usually nothing more than a stout stick or an old spearhead, and stand in the field while the Lord's reeve counts. You reminding you that in times of trouble, you serve not only with your hands, but with your body. And though you've never been called to march anywhere, you've heard stories of men sent to guard roads or fight in some squabble, far from home, returning months later to find their fields overrun with weeds and their families thinner than they left them. The manor court meets a few times a year, and attendance is not optional. So you stand in the crowd as the reeve announces fines for stray animals, for using the Lord's forest without leave, for not repairing the hedge in time, and even for arguing too loudly with a neighbor. And you realize that law here is less about justice and more about keeping order in a way that benefits the man who lives behind stone walls. There's a rhythm to it all. The sowing, the tending, the days given over to the domain, the collection of dues, the quiet resentment that flares and fades. And it's a rhythm you can tea-break without breaking yourself. Because the manor is not just a building. It's the heart of the system that feeds you only after it feeds itself. Sometimes you catch sight of the Lord himself, riding past on a tall horse, his cloak bright against a gray sky, and he might nod or not even glance your way. And you wonder if he knows your name, though you doubt it because to him you are just another peasant, interchangeable with the next. Yet there are moments when his presence is felt in less oppressive ways, like when he hosts a feast after a good harvest, and the village is invited to eat the scraps, drink the weaker ale, and listen to the minstrels. And for one night, you forget that the man whose generosity you re-enjoying is also the reason your hands are cracked and bleeding. You hear the old people say that this is the way of the world, that the Lord protects the land from raiders, settles disputes, and keeps the peace. And you nod along, even though you've never seen a raider, and the disputes you've been in were settled with fists long before they reached the manor court. Still you accept the terms, because the alternative is no land at all, and land even when it's half someone else's is the difference between living and drifting, between a roof of your own and sleeping in a ditch. The steward comes again at the end of the season to take the Lord's share, measuring the grain with a careful eye, counting the hens, and you watch the pile you worked for all year shrink with every scoop, the sound of grain hitting the cart like a drumbeat of surrender. And when it's over, you close your eyes for a moment, take a slow breath, and remind yourself that what's left is yours, and that as long as there's something left, you can make it to next season. And that thought is enough to keep you walking back to your hut. The shadow of the manor, long but not yet heavy enough to crush you. The feasts and fasts of the church year are as constant and inescapable as the seasons themselves. And they wind their way through your life like a second calendar layered over the turning of the fields, telling you when to rejoice, when to mourn, when to eat until you can barely move, and when to go hungry by choice, even if your belly is already empty. So you begin each year at Christmas with the bitter cold pressing against the walls of your hut, while the church bells call you to the celebration of Christ's birth. A mass lit by the flicker of candles and the heavy scent of incense that makes the air seem thick and otherworldly. And afterward, the Lord sometimes allows a feast in the village. Not just the scraps from his table, but roasted meats, thick bread, and ale enough to make the cold seem a distant thing. And you find yourself laughing more freely than you have in months. Even if you know the feeling will vanish the next day, when the routine begins again. Then comes Epiphany and Candlemas, each with its own rituals. The blessing of candles that will light the dark corners of your home through the rest of winter. And you notice how these holy days mark time in a way that the planting and reaping alone can, not giving a rhythm to the otherwise endless toil. Lent arrives with its long weeks of fasting. And here the difference between religious devotion and simple necessity blurs. Because abstaining from meat isn't hard when you couldn't afford it anyway, and historians still argue whether fasting was a spiritual discipline or a subtle way to stretch dwindling food supplies through the lean months. But you suspect it was both, because the church is nothing if not practical. Easter bursts upon you like a sudden sunrise. The church dressed in flowers, the hymns louder, the ale flowing again. And for a moment the fields, the dews, and the sickness seem far away, replaced by the taste of fresh bread and the sight of neighbors smiling without reserve. The quirky thing is that sometimes these feasts are less about piety and more about the simple joy of being allowed to break rules, eating forbidden foods, drinking more than you should, even dancing until your legs ache in the muddy village square, because those moments feel like snatched victories over the constant grind. Through spring and summer come the saints' days, each with its own flavor. St. George with games and contests, St. John with bonfires blazing against a warm night sky. And these gatherings are where you hear the latest news, swap seeds, and arrange the small trades that help keep you afloat. Harvest festivals bring both relief and exhaustion. The church blessing the first sheaves of grain, while you know full well that blessing or not, you'll be bending in the fields from dawn to dusk to bring it all in before the rains return. Michaelmas signals the turning of the year toward the darker half, a time to settle rents and dues. And though it's less merry than the other festivals, it still carries the comfort of tradition, a reminder that you've made it through another cycle. Advent begins the slow build toward Christmas again, marked by extra services and the faint hope that this winter might be kinder than the last. And the pattern repeats, weaving faith into your work until the two are inseparable. Yet for all the solemnity, the church's calendar is also an excuse to pause, to see faces you might otherwise only glimpse over a hedge or across a furrow, to eat something richer than pottage, to stand in a warm building lit by the glow of candles while the wind howls outside. You notice, too, how the church uses these days to remind you of your place in the order of things, sermons about obedience and humility. Nestled between blessings of bread and ale, the priest's eyes sweeping the congregation to make sure the message lands. But you also take from these days what you need, whether it's comfort in the chant of a hymn, the small thrill of sneaking an extra cup of ale, or the memory of dancing by firelight to carry you through the next week's labor. Sometimes during the fasting seasons you wonder if the lords and priests truly keep to the same rules, or if the rich tables in the manor and the abbey are still groaning with meat while you pick at salted fish. And you can't help but smile at the thought that even if they are breaking the rules, it's the one sin you would gladly share. The year winds on, the holy days coming and going like the tide, And you find that even if you can't remember the exact date, you can tell what's coming by the way the air feels, the way the people talk, the way the church smells of fresh greens or old wax. And you realize that this woven fabric of feasts and fasts is not just the church's way of guiding the soul, but a kind of survival map, pacing out joy and deprivation in a rhythm that keeps the village from breaking under the weight of endless sameness. And as you leave the latest celebration, the sound of the bells still ringing in your ears, you step back into the muddy street, knowing that tomorrow the work will be waiting. But tonight you've been fed, warmed, and reminded, however briefly, that life has more in it than toil. The daily grind of medieval peasant life is a slow, unending churn, the kind that starts before the sun has even decided to show its face and ends long after it has slipped back behind the horizon. And you wake not to the sound of any clock, but to the cock's crow, to the rustle of your family stirring in the dim light, to the thin smoke of the fire you banked low the night before, so the embers could survive until morning. And your first thought is often about what needs doing before the day burns too far. Because here, time is measured not in hours, but in tasks. The milking before the dew dries, the turning of the soil before it hardens, the mending of a fence before the sheep wander into the wrong strip. There's a rhythm to it, but no day is exactly the same. Because some mornings the weather smiles on you, and some mornings the wind cuts so sharp you feel it in your bones. And on the worst days, you pull on whatever layers you have, knowing they won't be enough, but you step outside anyway. Because animals and crops don't wait for comfort. Historians still argue whether peasants in your time had more leisure than later industrial workers, pointing to the feast days and seasonal lulls. But what they forget is that leisure here is never truly free. It's stolen from work you'll have to catch up on, borrowed from tomorrow's exhaustion, and the feast days themselves often demand labor and preparation. So while the miller or the smith might get a real pause, you never quite stop. In the spring, the days begin with breaking the ground, a slow and back-cocking process of guiding the heavy plow, if you're lucky enough to have an ox, or lending your hands to another's team. If you're not, and the quirky truth is that you can tell whose field belongs to whom, just by how the furrows run, some straight and proud, others wandering like a drunken path, and you take a small pride in keeping yours straight, even if no one else notices. Once the seeds are in, you spend weeks guarding them from birds, pulling weeds, and patching the gaps in the hedge or ditch, because every gap is an invitation to trouble. A neighbor's pig rooting in your barley, or worse, your own animals slipping into the Lord's domain where the fines are sharp and swift. Summer is both the best and the worst time, because the long days mean more work done, but also more work to do, and you find yourself in the fields from the first pale light until the bats begin to flicker in the sky, with only a break for whatever food you carried with you, usually a hunk of bread, a piece of cheese if you're lucky, and a flask of ale that's weak enough not to dull your wits, but strong enough to keep the water's sickness away. Harvest is a race against the weather, and every able hand is in the fields, even the smallest children gathering stray heads of grain. And you work with a kind of desperate focus, because each sheaf brought in is one more step away from winter hunger. Autumn brings the storing, grain threshed and winnowed, root vegetables buried in pits, firewood stacked high, and you feel a strange satisfaction in seeing the stores grow, though you also know that the manna share will come first, leaving you to calculate just how thin you can stretch what's left. Winter is slower in the fields, but not in the chores. Because animals still need tending, tools still need repairing, and your own clothes still need mending. And the short days mean more time indoors, with the constant press of bodies in a small space. A kind of closeness that's both comforting and suffocating. There's no such thing as idleness here, because even on the coldest, bleakest days, when the snow crusts over the furrows, there's rope to be braided, baskets to be woven, repairs to be made to the thatch before the wind takes it. And if by some miracle you find yourself with nothing urgent, you turn to small crafts that might bring in an extra penny at market. Carving spoons, making simple pots, spinning wool, each one a hedge against the uncertainty that always lurks on the edge of the year. The work is hard, yes, but it's also the thread that holds you in place. Because without it, you would drift. And drift here means ruin. So you keep your hands moving, your back bent, your mind tuned to the seasons. And even when your muscles ache and your skin is cracked, there's a strange peace in the knowledge that you're doing the same work your parents did, and their parents before them. And that in some quiet way, the land knows you as well as you know it. The duties you owe to your Lord are as fixed and inevitable as the sunrise, a web of obligations woven into every corner of your life, so tightly bound that you hardly think of them as separate from your own survival anymore. Yet each one is a reminder that you do not own the land you work. No matter how many generations of your family have bent their backs over it. And you know that from the moment you wake to the moment you rest, part of what you do is not for yourself at all, but for the manor, the castle, and the man who holds both in his name. The year begins with the tallying of rents, sometimes in coin, but more often in kind, a measure of grain, a set number of hens, a certain quantity of eggs or firewood, and if you fall short, the steward will note it down with a scratch of his quill and a look that promises trouble if it happens again. On certain days you must perform boon work, laboring on the Lord's domain fields, planting, weeding, harvesting, or repairing, and this work takes precedence over your own. Which means that while you're cutting his hay, your own grass is growing too long and losing its best sweetness, a loss you just have to swallow. Then there's the obligation to provide labor for repairs to the manor roads, bridges, or ditches, and you find yourself side by side with other villagers, hacking away at mud and hauling stones, your hands blistering from a day's toil that gains you nothing immediate, except the knowledge that the Lord can ride more comfortably from his hall to the next village. Historians still argue whether these obligations were crushing impositions or just part of the accepted order of life, and while it's true that some lords are less harsh than others, you've never met one who would willingly reduce your duties unless forced by famine, revolt, or sheer necessity. The quirky part is that sometimes the work is almost a welcome change. A day helping mend a palisade or dig a fish pond can feel easier than plowing your own stubborn strip, and the food given on these days is often better than what you'd have had at home, so you take the good with the bad. Yet there are dues beyond labor. The mill is the Lord's, and you must grind your grain there for a fee, no matter that your own hand corn could do it for free. The law is the law, and using it risks a fine or worse, so you pay in both coin and patience as you wait in line for your turn while the miller takes his cut. The oven is the Lord's too, and though you can bake small loaves at home, anything for market must be done in his oven for a fee. the smell of other people's bread mixing with yours as it bakes. Then there's the tithe to the church, a tenth of your produce, theoretically, for God. But you can't help noticing it keeps the priest well fed. And while it's not the Lord's due, it feels the same when you see your hard-earned grain leaving your hands. On top of all this are the small, constant reminders of your status. If you marry outside the manor, there's a fine. If your ox strays onto his meadow, there's a fine. If you gather firewood from his forest without permission, there's a fine. And the forest laws are so strict that even gathering fallen branches can be seen as theft. There are also the seasonal levies, a hen at Easter, a goose at Martinmas, and the obligations in times of war. When the Lord demands food, carts, and men to support his campaigns, leaving you short in the fields. And yet, for all this, there's an odd balance. The Lord is not a distant figure in a palace, but someone whose men you see regularly, whose hall you pass on the way to the fields, and sometimes, on rare feast days, he may even walk among you, tossing a coin to a child or nodding at your bow. In moments of crisis, a bad harvest, a flood, an attack, his resources can be the difference between survival and disaster. And so, while you chafe under his demands, you also understand that in the brutal arithmetic of medieval life, your fate and his are tangled together. Still, as you walk home from a day's boon work, your shoulders aching, you wonder what it would be like to till your own land, free of dues and obligations, to keep the full harvest you've sown. And that thought, dangerous though it may be, lingers like a spark waiting for a gust of wind. When sickness creeps into the village, it comes not like a sudden storm, but like a slow mist, curling into every hut, every cough carrying the possibility of ruin. And you can feel the air itself grow heavier when someone falls ill. Because here in your world there is no clear line between the ordinary fevers of life and the plagues that can strip a village bare in weeks. And so you live with a kind of constant low-level dread, even in healthy times, always watching for the first signs, the way a neighbor stays in bed past sunrise, the way the church bell tolls once, then twice in quick succession, marking the passing of a soul. The simplest ailments can be deadly. A cut gone bad, a fever that lingers, because there is no true medicine here, only herbs, charms, and the hands of those who claim knowledge passed down from elder to apprentice. And historians still argue whether medieval herbalism was more superstition than science, though in truth you've seen both miracles and failures. A poultice of comfrey drawing out infection one day, another patient dying under the same treatment the next. When plague strikes, the fear changes shape, becoming sharp and urgent. And you remember the last time it came, how the streets went quiet, how even the birds seemed to hush, how the smoke from so many pyres hung in the air until your clothes smelled of it for weeks, and how people you'd known your whole life seemed to vanish overnight. The quirky thing is that some villagers believe the plague can be kept at bay with strange rituals, carrying a posy of strong-smelling herbs, painting symbols on door lintels, even ringing the church bells at odd hours. And while you don't put much faith in these acts, you find yourself following them anyway, if only because it gives the illusion of control. Famine and plague often come together, each feeding the other's cruelty. For a hungry body is more easily taken by sickness, and a sick village cannot bring in a harvest, and the cycle can grind on until whole hamlets are left abandoned, roofs sagging, fields going to weed. You remember the great mortality, the time when carts of the dead rolled through nearby towns, when the priest could barely keep up with the burials, and how the survivors spoke in hushed voices about what they had seen. Entire families gone, dogs and pigs roaming free, houses boarded up with the occupants still inside. During such times, the manor's structure shifts with the Lord, sometimes granting temporary relief from dues simply because there aren't enough hands left to work the land. But you know this is not mercy, just necessity, for without peasants there is no wealth for him. Those who survive often find themselves strangely valued, courted, even as labor becomes scarce. And you've heard of peasants bargaining for better terms in the aftermath of plague. Years though, you've also heard of lords and kings passing laws to keep wages low and bind laborers more tightly to their manors, fearing the taste of freedom might spread. In your own home, you do what you can to keep sickness away, boiling water for drinking, storing food carefully to avoid rot, keeping animals out of living spaces as much as possible. But you also know that chance plays a heavier hand than preparation, and the healthiest, strongest man can be gone within days, while the frailest elder somehow lingers. When someone in your household falls ill, the air becomes thick with quiet, voices kept low, footsteps softened, as if noise itself might disturb the balance. And you tend them with what you have: willow bark for fever, garlic for strength, honey for wounds, and whispered prayers for what lies beyond your skill. If they recover, you give thanks. If they die, you bury them quickly, the earth taking them back without ceremony, beyond the words of the priest and the tears of those left behind. And life resumes because it must. Though the absence lingers like a missing tooth, you keep probing with your tongue. And so, year after year, you live between the visits of sickness, grateful for each healthy season, but never so foolish as to believe it will last. Because here, in your world, plague is not an if, but a when. And you measure your life in the stretches of calm that lie between its cruel returns. The rhythms of the church shape your days as much as the turning of the seasons, and even if you are not deeply pious, you cannot escape the calendar of feast days, fasts, and holy obligations. For the church is not only a place of worship, but the hub of your community's social life, its rules and rituals woven into every corner of existence. From the moment you are born and baptized to the day you are buried in consecrated ground. And though you sometimes grumble about the tithes and the demands for labor to repair the chapel roof or tend the priest's garden, you also find comfort in the familiar bells that mark the hours, the chant of Latin prayers you may not fully understand, but whose sound has rocked you to sleep since childhood. Each week the Sabbath brings a pause in field work. And though this means losing a day's labor, it also grants a rare chance to rest your back and catch up on news. For the churchyard is where gossip spreads faster than any market. Stories of births, deaths, betrothals, and quarrels retold and embroidered until they take on a life of their own. Historians still argue whether the medieval church's control over the peasantry was primarily spiritual or political. But you know from experience that it is both. The priest is as much an enforcer of order as a shepherd of souls, reminding you from the pulpit to obey your Lord and pay your dues, yet also blessing your seeds in spring and your harvest in autumn. So you hedge your frustrations with gratitude for the parts of the system that seem to work in your favor. There is also the rhythm of the liturgical year, the great feasts of Christmas and Easter. brightening the darkest and dreariest stretches, bringing with them music, shared meals, and a loosening of rules that lets ale flow more freely and songs grow louder. The quirky part being that some saints' days seem to have as much to do with ancient pagan customs as with Christianity. Midsummer fires, for example, or certain blessings of animals and fields that feel older than the faith itself. The church's influence extends into the most private matters. You cannot marry without its sanction, and your union must be blessed in public before God and witnesses. You cannot be buried outside its grounds without risking your soul's peace. And certain sins, theft, adultery, failure to fast, can bring penance that is as public as it is humiliating, requiring you to stand barefoot outside the church or process through the village in a hair shirt. And yet, for all the discipline and control, the church is also a source of aid, sometimes providing alms to the poor, sometimes sheltering the desperate, sometimes defending a peasant against a lord's overreach, especially if the wrong is blatant enough to offend both divine law and common decency. In times of sickness or famine, the priests may organize prayers or processions, leading the whole village in supplication. And whether or not these bring real relief, they bind you together in shared hope, which has its own kind of power. You know that monasteries, far away though they may seem, are centers of knowledge, keeping written records and tending herb gardens that can provide remedies not found in your own hedgerows. And occasionally a traveling monk or friar will pass through, bringing news from distant lands, tales of relics and miracles, and sometimes even practical advice that makes you see your world a little differently. Your life, in short, is framed by the church, not as an optional part of your existence, but as the scaffolding that supports and confines it at the same time. And while you sometimes imagine a life free of its reach, you cannot picture how such a thing would even work, for here, faith and survival are so tightly knotted that to untangle one from the other feels like unmaking the whole pattern of life itself. When war comes to your world, it does not announce itself with formal declarations or neat lines of soldiers, as in the tales sung by minstrels, but with rumors that seep into the village, from traders, pilgrims, or wandering beggars who speak of armies on the move, of border disputes turned violent, of a lord's quarrel that will spill across fields you know as well as your own hands. And you feel the tension build long before the first soldier appears, because the signs are unmistakable. The Lord's men-at-arms sharpening their weapons in the manor yard, strangers on the road traveling faster than usual, the reeve speaking in hushed tones with the bailiff, and a nervousness in the air that makes even the geese restless. When the soldiers do come, they come in a tide, trampling fields without care, pulling down fences for firewood, and taking what they please because their bellies demand it and because they can. And while your own lord might offer some protection within the palisade of his manor, the truth is that peasant bodies and goods are simply resources to be used in the greater game of noble ambitions. Historians still argue whether medieval warfare was truly as constant and chaotic as the chroniclers claimed, or whether the disruptions were more intermittent. But to you, one raid in a lifetime is enough to mark the memory forever. The smell of smoke from burning thatch, the screams of livestock being driven off, the taste of fear when you hide in the woods with your family, praying they do not find you. There is a quirky detail that seems almost absurd in the midst of such violence. Some armies march under banners bearing saints' images, and soldiers will pause to attend mass before charging into battle. as if divine blessing could erase the devastation they are about to unleash. In war's shadow, you learn quickly to make yourself and your possessions as unappealing as possible, hiding grain in pits, smearing valuables with filth so they seem worthless, even smudging your face with soot to appear sickly and thus less desirable to press into service. For that is another danger, being taken as part of the war effort, pressed into carrying supplies, digging trenches, or worse, fighting, though the last is rare for peasants, unless the cause is desperate. You remember the story of old Bernard from the next village over, taken to haul stones for a siege, and returning months later with his back twisted and his eyes haunted, speaking little of what he saw except to say that men can be more cruel to each other than wolves. The disruption lingers long after the soldiers are gone, fields left unplanted, tools stolen, livestock scattered or dead, roofs damaged and stores of grain emptied, and famine often follows war as surely as night follows day, for even if you survive the raids, you must still face the bare months ahead with less than you need. Sometimes, oddly, war brings opportunities. A lord weakened by conflict may be forced to grant lighter dues to keep his peasants from fleeing, or abandoned land may be claimed and worked by those bold enough to take it. And you've heard of men who return from service in war with better skills or rare goods, though such stories are few and usually gloss over the cost and suffering. The church may preach that all wars are just, if blessed by God, yet you have seen how the suffering of peasants is the same no matter whose banner flaps overhead, and you have learned that loyalty is less a matter of grand ideals than of sheer survival, siding with whoever seems least likely to destroy your home at that moment. Once the war moves on, the task is to rebuild, to mend fences, and rethatch roofs, to coax the fields back into production, and to scrub away the signs of destruction. Though the scars, both in the land and in the memory, never fully vanish, lying just beneath the surface, ready to be remembered with the next rumor of distant conflict. Because here, in your life, war is not some heroic tale, but a shadow that can fall without warning and linger long after the banners have disappeared over the horizon. Taxes and tithes weigh on you like an invisible yoke, not the kind you see resting on the shoulders of oxen in the fields, but one that digs just as deep into your back all the same, a burden you can neither set aside nor truly escape, because no matter how good or bad the harvest is, no matter if the year has brought sickness, fire, or storm, the collectors still come, and they do not accept excuses as readily as the weather accepts your prayers. The first claim on your labor and goods is from your own Lord, whose right to your dues is backed by both tradition and the sharp points of his retainer spears. And you know the list by heart, part of your grain, part of your livestock, days of labor on the domain fields, repairs to the manor buildings, and sometimes special levies, for things like paying a ransom if your lord is captured in war, or funding the marriage portion for his daughter. Then comes the crown's reach, usually through taxes collected by the sheriff or other royal officials. And while you may never set eyes on the king himself, his need for coin to fund wars or projects trickles down to you, in the form of demands for silver pennies that you can only gather by selling produce at market or partying with goods you'd rather keep. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were truly crushed by taxation or whether most obligations were survivable in a good year. But you know the truth lies in the rhythm of feast and famine. where one bad season can make the difference between just managing to meet the demands and sinking into debt. And then there is the church, which takes its tithe, a tenth of all you produce, in the name of God. And though you sometimes question whether the wealth of the cathedral in the distant city truly comes from divine will, you also know better than to speak such thoughts aloud, for the priest's ear is sharp and his influence is long. The quirky part is that sometimes the tithe is not in coin or grain, but in stranger forms, like honey from your hives, wool from your sheep, or even candles made from your own beeswax, offerings that end up burning before the altar or lighting the homes of the clergy. The collection process itself is a kind of ritual. The steward or reeve appears with written lists or a tally stick. The measurements are made with baskets and scoops, whose size always seems to favor the collector, and the goods are carted away while you watch, powerless to do more than hope there will still be enough left for your family. Failure to meet these obligations is not an option without consequences. Fines, confiscation of goods, or even imprisonment in the manorial stocks, where the whole village can see your shame, and so you sometimes resort to quiet evasions, hiding a sack of grain in a hollow under the floorboards, or claiming a chicken was taken by a fox when in truth it is roasting in your hearth. You hear whispers of more dangerous forms of resistance, of villages in distant shires refusing to pay until a grievance is addressed. But those stories often end with soldiers arriving to enforce compliance, and the example is clear enough to keep you in line. The layering of dues from lord, crown, and church means you are always calculating, always trading one necessity for another, always trying to stretch the thin edge of your resources over demands that never lessen. And while in a good year, you might just manage with a bit to spare, in a bad year, you are forced into borrowing from wealthier neighbors or from the very officials who collect from you, knowing that debt is another chain, one that can bind you for years. Sometimes you wonder if anyone above you in this chain of obligation truly understands what it means to hand over food in the dead of winter, or to sell the only pig that could have bred the next season's stock, just to meet a tax. And though you cannot change the system, you cling to small acts of agency, bartering goods to avoid coin payments, joining with neighbors to share resources, or simply telling the collectors as little as possible about what you've managed to store away. The toll of taxes and tithes is not only in what you lose, but in the constant awareness that your labor is never entirely your own, that the sweat on your brow is measured and accounted for in places far from your field, and yet you endure it because, like the rain and the frost, it is a part of the life you were born into, a force you can curse under your breath, but must ultimately work around. If you hope to see another year's harvest, travel beyond your village is rare, not because you lack curiosity about the world beyond the hedgerows, but because every mile you put between yourself and home is a gamble with your safety, your livelihood, and sometimes even your freedom. For the road is not a smooth ribbon of stone leading to adventure, but a twisting, rutted, muddy track where carts break wheels, horses founder, and strangers eye you with the suspicion that only comes from living in a world where news is slow and trust is slower. Still, there are times when you must go to a distant market, to pay dues at the Lord's main manor, to attend a fair, or to visit kin in another parish. And when you set out, you do so with careful preparation, wearing your sturdiest shoes or boots if you are lucky enough to have them, carrying food wrapped in cloth, and perhaps a small cudgel or knife for protection. Because while the law is meant to guard travelers, it often lags behind the reality of ambushes by desperate men or wandering soldiers between postings. Along the way, you pass through landscapes that feel almost like different worlds. Deep forests where the light barely reaches the ground, and every snapping twig could be a deer or a thief. Open heats where the wind whips at your face, and you can see far ahead, yet still feel exposed. And the occasional cluster of cottages or an inn where you might stop to rest. Though an inn's welcome depends on your ability to pay or offer goods in trade. Historians still argue whether medieval roads were as dangerous as the later romantic tales make them seem, or whether most travel was simply slow and uncomfortable. But you know that even the rare, uneventful journey is tiring in its own way. For the constant watchfulness drains you as much as the miles. A quirky detail you notice is the system of wayside crosses or shrines that dot certain routes placed there by pious donors to guide travelers and perhaps remind bandits that God sees all. Though whether that truly deters them is another question. When you reach a market town, it feels like stepping into another rhythm entirely. Noise from hawkers and buyers calling out prices. The clink of coins in hands, the smell of roasting meat mingling with the less pleasant stench from the open gutters, and stalls selling goods you rarely see. Bright dyed cloth, spices in little packets, tools of finer make than your village smith can produce. You might sell your surplus there or buy things you cannot make yourself, like salt, iron nails, or even a small scrap of imported silk to tuck away as a gift for someone at home. The market is also a place where news travels, carried by merchants and minstrels, and you hear of distant battles, strange weather in other lands, or changes in the law that may or may not ever touch your life. The return journey is often harder, weighed down with your purchases and the fatigue of the day. And if night falls before you reach home, you face the choice of pushing on in the dark or risking the unknown shelter of a roadside host, where the straw bed might be shared with lice, or the ale might be watered down, but still safer than drinking from an unfamiliar stream. You know stories of those who traveled farther, pilgrims to Canterbury or Santiago, traders who followed rivers all the way to great cities, or soldiers marching across the sea. And you imagine the wonders they've seen, though you also know many never returned, claimed by illness, shipwreck, or the simple fact of finding no safe road back. Travel, when you must do it, sharpens your sense of what you leave behind, the familiar shape of your own doorway, the sound of your village's church bell, the faces you know well enough to read without words. And as you set down your bundle at the end of the journey, you feel a satisfaction deeper than the goods you've brought. The relief of being back in the one small corner of the world, where, for all its hardships, you understand the rules well enough to survive them. The yearly cycle turns again and again, a wheel that grinds away the years of your life, but also holds the pattern that lets you survive them. And as the seasons shift, you feel the changes in your bones as much as you see them in the land. Winter's bite loosens its grip, and the ground softens under your boots, and you find yourself out in the fields as the first pale shoots push through, knowing that the work you do now will decide whether the next winter is one of plenty or hunger, because every step, every swing of the hoe, every scattering of seed is a wager against the whims of weather, pest, and fortune. The plowing is steady and rhythmic, the oxen straining against the yoke, the smell of turned earth rising rich and damp. And even as you sweat, you think ahead to the summer, to the long days of weeding, repairing fences, and tending livestock, because each part of the cycle demands its own labor, and there is no skipping one without breaking the whole. Summer itself is both a blessing and a curse. The sun gives light enough to work from dawn to near dark, but it also drains you, leaving your clothes clinging to your skin, your throat parched unless you pause for a sip from the jug, and the flies buzzing in your ears. This is a season when the meadows are cut for hay, when sheep are sheared and the wool sorted and washed, and when you keep a wary eye on the skies for sudden storms that can flatten a crop or send the river spilling over its banks. Autumn is the season of reckoning, when the grain is harvested and threshed, the fruit picked, the vegetables dug from the soil and laid out to dry or stored away, and every measure you take is shadowed by the knowledge that the tithe will soon be due. The tax collectors not far behind, and whatever is left after their share must last your household until the earth softens again. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant year was truly one of constant toil, or whether there were seasons of rest that modern imaginations overlook. But you know the truth is that any pause in the work is usually filled with other tasks: mending tools, patching roofs, preparing for festivals, tending to animals, because nature itself rarely gives you a week without demands. One quirky part of the cycle is the way certain festivals seem perfectly timed to break the monotony. A feast day after the haying, a fair when the lambs are old enough to sell, a church procession just before Lent. And though these events have deep religious meaning, they also serve as markers in your own mental calendar, moments to look forward to when the work feels endless. As the year rolls toward winter again, you begin to close the circle, slaughtering animals you cannot feed through the cold months, salting the meat, storing root vegetables in the cellar, patching your cloak so it can last another season, and making sure the hearth has enough wood stacked nearby to keep the frost from claiming your fingers in the night. The days shorten, the fields turn brown and quiet under frost, and you spend more hours indoors telling stories by the fire, repairing nets, weaving cloth, or carving small objects from wood. The kinds of work that warm your hands without requiring the constant bending and lifting of the warmer months. But winter is also the season of risk, when illness moves more easily from one house to another, when food stores must be guarded against vermin, when even a small injury can linger for weeks in the cold. Still, the turning of the year offers its own comfort, for you have seen it all before, and you know that in the depths of frost and darkness, the earth is only resting, storing its strength for another spring. Your own strength, however, is not so easily renewed, and yet you carry on, because the cycle is both your burden and your shelter. A rhythm older than you, older than the village, older perhaps than the very roads you walk, and as long as you keep pace with it, you know you can last another turn of the wheel. Festivals and fairs are the bright threads woven into the otherwise rough cloth of your year, and though they arrive less often than you might wish, their memory lingers like the aftertaste of something rich and rare, a flavor that carries you through the leaner, quieter days. The village comes alive in a way that feels almost impossible during the long stretches of work, as though someone has thrown open a hidden door and let the air itself sparkle for a while, and you find yourself moving with a different sort of energy, not the weary rhythm of the fields, but a buoyant step, a sense of anticipation that begins building days before the event itself. fairs, often tied to the feast day of a saint or the changing of the season, bring traders from far-off towns, and suddenly your village green or the nearest market square swells with people whose clothes are cut in unfamiliar styles, whose accents twist familiar words into strange shapes, and whose goods carry the scent of distant places. Barrels of salted fish from the coast, bolts of cloth dyed in colors deeper than any your own dyer can manage, little pouches of spices that smell like they've been carried on the wind of another world entirely. The air is thick with smells, both mouth-watering and overwhelming. Roasted meat turning slowly over a fire. Honey cakes dusted with sugar, if you are lucky enough to be in a wealthy town. The tang of strong ale sloshing from mugs as people laugh and jostle. And somewhere in the background, the sharper scent of animals brought for trade or competition. You drift among the stalls, pausing to watch a tinker mend a pot with quick, practiced taps, or a glass blower shape a shining vessel in the glow of his portable furnace, and you marvel at how his work seems both fragile and eternal. Music threads its way through the crowd. The high, sweet notes of a flute, the steady beat of a drum, the bright plucking of a lute, and sometimes the tunes are familiar enough that you hum along, while other times they are strange, their patterns like unfamiliar roads winding through a land you've never walked. The festival itself is not only about trade and spectacle, but about binding the community together. For these gatherings are where disputes can be quietly resolved over a shared drink, where marriages are arranged with the careful exchange of glances and goods, where you might meet a cousin you have not seen in years and hear news of family in far-off hamlets. Games and contests draw crowds. Archery for the men who fancy themselves sharp-eyed, races for the young and quick, wrestling matches that draw cheers and groans from spectators, and sometimes stranger competitions, like climbing a greased pole to reach a dangling ham or pie at the top. There are traveling performers too, jugglers tossing knives that flash in the sunlight, storytellers spinning tales so vivid you can almost see the dragons or saints before you, and acrobats who tumble and leap as if the laws of the earth have briefly been suspended. Historians still argue whether medieval fairs were truly the raucous, colorful spectacles later writers have described, or whether they were more restrained, more practical. But to you, standing in the middle of the noise and color, it feels like a door has opened to a place where the usual rules have been set aside. A quirky custom you always look forward to is the mummers' play performed by a group of villagers in makeshift costumes. Some wearing masks carved from wood, others draped in ribbons and bells, who tell a familiar story of death and rebirth, of a hero slain and then revived, though each year they add their own twists and jokes, poking gentle fun at the people watching. As the day stretches toward evening, torches are lit, casting flickering gold on faces flushed with drink and laughter, and you feel the air cool against your skin as the sun slips below the horizon. There is dancing now, a weaving pattern of steps that changes from one song to the next, and even those who claim they do not dance find themselves drawn into the rhythm. By the time you leave, your feet ache and your head is light, your pouch perhaps a little emptier, but your heart strangely full, carrying home not only whatever goods you have bought, but also the sense that, for a brief span of hours, life has been larger, brighter, and louder than it is on any other day. When you wake the next morning, the fair already feels half like a dream, but the memory lingers, ready to be brought out again, when the days grow long and the work grows heavy. A reminder that the year holds moments of joy as well as toil, and that you will stand in that crowd again. Smell the roasting meat, hear the music, and feel that fleeting sense of stepping outside the narrow borders of your daily life into something grander, if only for a little while. Folk beliefs and superstitions wrap around your life like an invisible net, sometimes comforting, sometimes constricting, but always there, woven from threads of faith, fear, and the strange patterns people find in the world when they need explanations for things no one can fully control. And you grow up learning these rules as naturally as you learn to walk, absorbing them from parents, neighbors, and the old woman who lives at the edge of the village and always seems to know when the weather will change. You carry charms in your pocket or stitched into your clothing, a sprig of rowan to ward off evil spirits, a small pouch of salt to keep sickness at bay, an iron nail in the threshold to turn away witches. And though you may laugh at them on bright summer days, you still make sure they are in place when the nights grow long and the wind moans in the eaves. Certain days on the calendar are marked, not just for saints, but for their hidden dangers or powers. You know not to start a new journey on certain Fridays, not to work the fields on particular feast days when the saints themselves might be offended, and to hang garlands of herbs on Midsummer's Eve to keep away whatever walks the lanes that night. Animals are messengers in this unspoken language. A black cat crossing your path might mean bad luck unless you spit 3 times over your shoulder. A barn owl calling near the house could be a sign of death. A fox seen at dawn might bring prosperity if you greet it politely. And you find yourself watching these small encounters with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Because even if you do not fully believe, you have seen enough strange coincidences to think twice before ignoring them. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed these superstitions in a literal way, or whether they were more like traditions, cultural habits that gave shape to uncertainty. But for you, living in a world where plague can strike without warning and crops can fail overnight, it feels foolish not to make every small offering to tilt fortune in your favor. A quirky charm you once saw involved tying a frog's leg inside a child's bonnet to cure whooping cough, something that seemed absurd and a little cruel to you, but which the mother swore had worked after nothing else did. There are rituals for birth, placing an iron key under the bed to protect the mother, whispering the child's name only after 3 days to keep fairies from stealing it, and rituals for death, like stopping the clock in the room so the soul can pass freely, or opening the windows so it can fly away. The church warns against these practices, calling them remnants of pagan ways. But even the priest mutters certain old blessings over the fields that are nowhere in his holy book, and you suspect that the line between faith and folk belief is thinner than he likes to admit. Illness is often fought with prayers and herbs together, a blending of remedies that feel both sacred and earthy. And sometimes you think that the power is not in the charm itself, but in the way it focuses the will, gives people something to hold on to. When everything else feels beyond reach, dreams are read like messages. A dream of teeth falling out might mean a death is coming. A dream of running water could foretell a journey. And you wake some mornings trying to remember every detail, just in case it might help you prepare. The seasons themselves carry omens. The first thunder in spring should be greeted with a bow. The last leaf to fall from the village oak is a sign of who will live longest, and a winter with more than 3 heavy snowfalls means a poor harvest ahead. Even the way a candle burns in a dark room can tell a story. A steady flame means calm days. A flickering one could mean visitors. And if it gutters for no reason, someone nearby may be thinking ill of you. You follow these signs, not because you believe they can change the future entirely, but because they make the future feel less like a dark forest and more like a road with a few faint markers to guide your way. In the quiet moments when you sit by the fire and listen to the wind, you wonder how many of these customs will live on after you, passed to your children and theirs, and whether they will still feel that small shiver of reassurance when they tie a red thread around their wrist or place a sprig of rosemary above the door. Because even in an age when the church bells call you to one kind of faith, the older earthbound ways still hum beneath the surface, whispering their promises to those who will listen. The legacies of the peasant life do not fade easily, and even as years turn into decades and the memory of certain hard seasons softens at the edges, the skills, the rhythms, and the quiet resilience you have learned settle deep into your bones and into the very fabric of the community around you, shaping how you live and how you pass on what you know to those who come after. You have been taught from childhood how to coax food from the soil with your hands alone, how to mend tools when metal is scarce and money scarcer, how to read the sky for signs of coming rain or frost. And these are not the sorts of lessons you forget when you leave the fields for a few days or even a few years. For they are stitched into you like the coarse but sturdy seams of a homespun tunic. And you teach them to your children almost without thinking, showing them how to set a seed just deep enough, how to spot the difference between a healthy plant and one that is about to fail, how to dry herbs so they will keep through the winter. Because in a world where fortune can turn in a single bad season, knowledge is as much a safeguard as food in the cellar. The stories you carry are another part of this legacy. Tales passed down by the fire in long dark winters. Some about saints who performed miracles in distant lands. Others about clever peasants who tricked greedy lords. And still others so old that no one remembers their origins. Stories where the forest itself seems alive and rivers have voices that sing in the night. And while historians still argue whether these oral traditions are accurate reflections of the past or ever-shifting mirrors shaped by each generation, you know that they hold truths that matter to the people who hear them, truths about endurance, wit, and the quiet victories of those who live far from power. There are also the communal customs, like the way neighbors come together to raise a barn or bring in a harvest when one family cannot manage alone. Traditions of shared labor that make survival possible and that are remembered long after the work is done, turning into the sort of memories that bind a village together through the years. You remember being a child and watching your elders work side by side without a word about payment, the reward being a full granary for all. And you realize now that this unspoken pact is one of the greatest inheritances you have, a form of wealth that no famine or plague can quite erase. A quirky but enduring tradition is the carving of small marks into door frames or barn beams, sometimes simple initials, sometimes strange runes, to record who built them or to mark a year of plenty. And even when those marks fade with weather and time, the knowledge that they are there becomes a kind of link to those who came before. The tools themselves become heirlooms, a scythe sharpened and resharpened across generations, a cooking pot blackened by decades of fires, a wooden chest with joints worn smooth by countless hands opening and closing its lid. And each carries with it the memory of those who used it. so that even an ordinary day's work feels connected to a long chain of lives. Your songs, too, form part of this legacy. Work songs that match the rhythm of swinging a flail or turning a millstone. Lullabies that blend Christian blessings with older words no one fully understands. And festival songs that shift slightly from year to year but always return at the same season, each one tying you back to the voices of people long gone. There is pride in this continuity, in knowing that even if the Lords change, even if the land itself is divided or sold, the knowledge you hold and the customs you keep will still exist in some form, carried forward like embers from an old fire into the hearths of new homes. You sometimes wonder what will remain in centuries to come, whether your descendants will still plant by the phases of the moon, still hang sprigs of certain herbs in the rafters, still tell the story of the man who outwitted the tax collector by filling his cart with hollowed turnips. And you suspect that while the details may change, the heart of it will endure, because at its core, the peasant life is about making do with what you have, finding joy where you can, and passing on the ways that keep body and spirit intact in a world that can be both harsh and beautiful. Even in moments when change seems overwhelming, when new tools appear, when strange crops are introduced, when the whispers of far-off wars reach your ears, you hold to the thread of what you have learned, and that thread leads back through the hands of your parents, your grandparents, and countless others, binding you to them in a lineage of survival and quiet strength that is worth more than any coin, because it is the reason you are here at all, telling these stories, singing these songs, and planting seeds that you may never see fully grow. And now, with the fields lying quiet under the weight of frost, and the air so still you can hear the soft creak of wood in the beams above your head, you let the rhythm of the year fade into a gentle hush. The fire burns low, its light spilling in slow waves over the floor, and outside, the night has drawn its curtain fully, shutting away the world until morning. You feel the heaviness in your limbs, as if the seasons themselves have settled into your bones, and the memories of harvest and hunger, of warmth and cold, drift past like smoke that curls and fades before you can quite catch it. There is no need to think of the Lord's dues tonight, or the market road, or the wary glances at the weather. Those can belong to tomorrow and tomorrow's work. For now, it is enough to listen to the faint wind rattling against the shutters, to feel the slow rise and fall of your own breathing, to let the images of fields and rivers, of oxen and plows, of hearth and home, soften into something almost like a dream. The wheel of the year will keep turning whether you watch it or not, and it is safe to close your eyes and let it turn without you for a little while. So you sink deeper into the quiet, deeper into the warmth, until even the last glimmer of firelight is only a memory, and the night holds you in its steady, unhurried embrace.